It is my great pleasure to introduce Ashley Huffman.
That was really an opportunity to make up a really cool name, but I appreciate you finding mine. Very cool. All right, so, clicker. All right, so this is a quick slide on who I am. I am a haptics hype man. That's kind of my role in life. I love haptics. I love with all my heart. I work full-time at a company called Titan Haptics. We make advanced haptic motors, but I also run a podcast called Haptics Club. I have a newsletter called All Things Haptics. It's an area I just love so much because there's so much potential. There's so much place for people to be creative and to come up with new ways to engage with technology, which I love technology. Huge tech nerd. So that's why I'm here. Just as like a brief overview, so we're all on the same page with what haptics is. Haptics is a way that you can have technology communicate with you through touch. It's used in a lot of different ways. Some people use it to make things more realistic. Some people make it so you can feel a click, a button. Other times people want it so you can feel a purring of a cat. There's a lot of potential in the world of haptics, and these are just some of the use cases that people use, and that's a motor from Titan Haptics. There's a lot of different types of motors. You may have seen some of the cool stuff on the floor today of just like gloves, vests. There's a lot of cool stuff happening there, so hopefully you got a chance to see it. And of course, I love to use this slide because haptics isn't just like some cute little like, oh, cute haptics boop, like, you know, small kind of industry. It's a billion-dollar industry. It's in pretty much every consumer product that's out there. So there's a lot of value in the market, and there's also in that a lot of opportunity. You may know it from your gaming controller, you may know it from your smartphone, but for, you know, everyone else in the industry, I see some really cool folks here that are doing really cool stuff in haptics. I see you over there, Peter, doing really cool stuff in haptics. And so I think today I'm really excited to actually introduce folks on this panel because we have some of the greatest industry players in the haptics field who are doing amazing things. I'm going to just quickly give a shout out to each one, and they'll give you a spiel of who they are and advertise for what they're up to. But Alex is from Contact CI. He's also from Between Realities. Kim Oberg is from Haptics. You've probably checked out their awesome glove. Hopefully you got a chance to. Some really cool stuff there. Crystal Kim from Haptics, great consumer experiences, so going to bring a lot of value to us from the conversation from a consumer's perspective. And of course, Rolf, we got here from Sensory X. So these are the panelists. I'm going to let them do a brief on themselves so they can hawk their wares, and then we're going to jump into a really badass conversation around haptics. So, Alex.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Meland. I go by Alex VR sometimes in the VR space. That's like my Twitter handle is AlexVR. As Ashley mentioned, I work at Contact CI. We make a multi-force ergonomic haptic glove for enterprise training solutions, kind of the idea of like getting the muscle memory from a hands-on virtual environment and taking it straight over into a real-life application. I'm also the co-host of the Between Realities VR podcast. We do that. That's right, baby. We do it every Friday on YouTube, and it's of course available on the other platforms as well, but YouTube is the place to see it. And I actually got my start in the haptics industry by working with the great people at Haptics, like Crystal over here. So I used to do some like haptic design for Haptics before making the transition over to Contact CI. So thank you all for being here.
All right, Kim.
Sure. I'm Kim Oberg, and I run sales and business development at Haptics. So if you've gone into the exhibition hall and you walk in, turn left, see us. We have a booth with Lowe's this year. I'm sorry for the very long wait, but it is an excellent experience, and I encourage you to go in and check it out. So I've been with Haptics for about 5 years. Haptics as a company has been around since 2012, and we are starting with gloves, and beyond that, it's a little bit secret, but we've already announced we're working on an exoskeleton, and we work in virtual reality and in robotics, telerobotics.
Hi, I'm Crystal. I'm a business development manager at Haptics. I've been with the company for about 4 years now. The company has been around since 2015. We are committed to bring the haptic technology to everyday life, making it available for everyone at home. So we make consumer haptic devices, and yeah, so we are working hard to make it compatible with a lot of VR titles, working with developers. Thank you.
So thanks. Hi, I'm Rolf. I'm from SensorX. SensorX is a startup still. I mean, we've been around since 2017, working on gloves. In the beginning, not on haptic gloves, but recently we kind of entered the space too with a novel technology, which we presented recently at IEEE VR. And we're also looking into other ways of basically interacting with virtual spaces. So we are launching a new input device, like a stylus, which of course also has haptics, but it's not in a glove space. But yeah, thanks.
Awesome, very cool. Thank you guys for your intro, and I'm gonna check out some of those other demos. Kim, you got me hyped on that. I'm curious to see what's going on there. Absolutely, sign me up, sign me up. To kick things off, I would love to talk about key considerations when designing haptic experiences. That's a key one, like how to approach it, what are the key things you need to think about when doing so. And you can talk about it from each of your verticals and your spaces, because I think that provides a lot of value to the audience who are from different areas of life. So Alex, if you wanna kick us off, key considerations.
Sure. So there's a few things to keep in mind that come kind of like top of mind for me when you ask me this question. And the first one is a little bit of the issue of friction, especially like if you're thinking about like making haptics hardware. Haptics a lot of times becomes a like third-party kind of thing, or like an extra thing, or a peripheral thing a lot of the times. And there's quite a bit of friction that is involved with some of that. I think the closer that we can like make haptics like a native aspect of the technology that we're using, and like have it like built in and integrated fully, and kind of removing that layer of friction for everyone, the closer we are to getting like the adoption of some of these like wilder types of haptic interactions that we're talking about. And of course when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about like gloves, vests, like body haptics, as opposed to just like the things that are coming in your controller and stuff like that. In terms of designing a haptic experience, I think it's important to think about like your highs and your lows, right? Like what's like the maximum vibration or the maximum force we can apply, and what's like the least force that we can apply for it to be like registered, and try to spread out give values to the interactions that you're having kind of based off of that scale. So like if you're designing for a VR game and the motor has a maximum vibration that it can do, you probably want the like hardest hitting like explosion in the game to be sitting at that, you know what I mean? And you can kind of scale things evenly based off of what the devices are capable of. Another thing too to consider is using haptics doesn't always have to be this like one-to-one experience, like, oh, I touched something, so therefore I felt something. I'm really interested in seeing more people use haptics to convey information in a way that's not audio or visual, that like, you could like have like a pattern of vibrations that means one thing, or you could even have a whole alphabet, that you could eventually learn, which of course introduces more friction, but Morse code, something like that. The point I'm making is that I'm interested in seeing haptics used more as a method of conveying information that you don't need to rely on audio or visual cues to interpret.
Awesome, love that. Kim, I'd love to know from your perspective, because you've got some really amazing demos where you're replicating things like a spider crawling across your hand, gripping blocks. Like, how does your team approach that in considerations?
So we don't do anything consumer focused. We're wholly enterprise, government, and academic.
Yep.
And so what we do in development is we think about what are the use case scenarios. We have kind of two sides of the coin. You need to look at it from a business perspective. How much is this going to be? How much can people afford to pay for this thing? And what are the features that we put in? Because we used to have thermal in a system, but it was frankly so expensive that we took that out and just provided you super high fidelity feedback. So we have people that come to me and they tell me what their use case scenarios are. And it's fascinating to sit where I sit, because people tell me, and the customer base is so broad, everything from the Air Force training maintainers how to fix a C-130 airship because it costs $50,000 a day to take that out of service in order to train a maintainer, so it's a whole lot cheaper to do it in the virtual environment, plus they can make mistakes and no one gets hurt, the plane doesn't crash. Training surgeons, training, so many people, training, design, engineering, and robotics that's basically the market sectors in which haptics is operating. And, I'm learning everything from, once you get a mile deep in a drilling for oil scenario with your drill bit. It then costs $100,000 to move that drill bit by a quarter of an inch. Who knew? So they want to make sure, they're like, look, if we touch the drill bit, if we feel it, we can get the nuances, we can feel that and make it much more accurate than what the machines are able to do. I had no idea. So we're learning all the time, but effectively when we're creating a solution, we are discovering what the use case scenarios are, imagining what part of the body do you need to interact with. Right now we're just making gloves, but our actuators can be placed anywhere on the body. It would be very expensive, but it is possible to do Ready Player One now.
Yep.
And then all right, our biomedical engineers do lots of testing to figure out what is the density, what is the force that needs to be applied in order to give you the correct or necessary amount of sensation. What is the modulation to convey friction and texture? What is, all the nuances that you need, both in sensation and force feedback and restriction, and it's putting all those factors together to best meet the needs of our customers.
Is your team like going out to test these things? Like, how do you mimic it in a way that's realistic, where the customer's like, yeah, this is it.
That's a really good question. So it's in many ways trial and error. We want it to be as natural as possible, and our engineers, of course, have hands of their own.
Yep.
So they test it on themselves, and the biomedical engineers also have, of course, lots of training and expertise in this area. So there's a thing called a two-point test. Maybe we've all done this as children. Effectively you take two distinct points and you come closer together, and it's when you can no longer differentiate between 2 points to 1 point. So we've done that. We've done all kinds of other testing in order to ascertain physiologically what is required in order to convey the fidelity that is necessary. And fidelity doesn't have to be the same for everyone in all use case scenarios.
Yeah.
Like, I'm often on the receiving end of, oh, you guys have 133 actuators. We only need fingertips, but we need it to be the fidelity that you provide. Can you make us custom gloves? Well, yeah, anything for a price. But, just not everyone is looking for the same solution. So oftentimes I'm on the receiving end of, oh, you've got a really cool product. I want that. And then they say, how much does it cost? And I tell them, and they go, what do you know that's in the market that's a lot cheaper? So it's, the right price point, the right solution. And that's the conversational manner that we have in sales at Haptics, to really kind of right size and make sure the solution that we're offering is the right one for you.
Awesome. And Crystal, from a more consumer perspective, what are some of the things, the key considerations that you have? Because you have some like really badass like gaming situations that you're incorporating your vest into. What are the considerations for developing haptics for that?
For us, as we are, as you mentioned, we are doing consumer market. So for haptics to make sense, like the feeling has to be great, but at the same time, if there's no content to enjoy with, there's no point for people to use the device. So for us, the key thing is to offer as much content as much as possible, to give more to enjoy the haptics with. And to make that happen, I think it's really important that the haptics to be perfectly in sync with what's happening within the content, so that it doesn't hurt your experience, or it doesn't take you out of the experience, but it makes you actually more immersed, not just it's an accessory to the content to make your experience better. So yeah, I think the key things we do is to always try to consider what's happening within the content, and to make the haptic patterns as natural as possible within the vibrotactile technology we use. Yeah.
Cool. I'm curious, when it's too much. Like, I think designing haptics is interesting because there's kind of like always something happening in like a game. So it's like pinpointing when to use haptics is like, it could be even an industry, is a tough choice. Like maybe Alex or Chris, you can jump in.
Absolutely. That's kind of, I did quite a bit of that when I was working with Haptics, and it is very interesting because I was often talking to the community, and I would very, very much hands-on play the game, decide for myself what haptic events I thought would be relevant to the experience, and kind of made like the haptic profile that I thought would be the best.
Yep.
And after people played it and I started getting feedback from people, it's interesting because everyone kind of has a different expectation as to what they're going to get out of that stuff based on the kind of player that they might be. You know, so for example, there was a custom mod made for the game Population 1, and the guy who made it did everything. Like, if you're flying through the air, there's wind patterns. If you're firing your guns, there's recoil patterns. If you're taking damage, you can feel where it is. You know, if you throw a grenade, an explosion, there's that. If you drink a soda, you can feel it fall down. Like, every single interaction had a haptic experience. And I loved that. For me, that makes it really immersive, and I'm connecting to every single thing that's happening in the game. But not everybody wants to feel everything.
Yep.
Like, there are competitors out there, and they're like, I only want to feel something when I take damage.
Yep.
Because otherwise it's all getting muddied, and if I'm firing a machine gun and the vest is shaking like crazy, how am I going to know if I'm getting hit? Because it's like muddying up the haptic experience. So I think another thing that would be huge that people should be considering is the fact that different people and will have like different expectations of their haptic experience, and the more options that you can provide for people to customize that haptic experience is a really good thing to keep in mind. Because sometimes, you know, if you're like playing a racing game, maybe they have haptics for accelerating the car, you know, but that could be too much for some of the users. So like a list where you could go down and be like, unclick that haptic, and like really customize the profile. I think there's a lot of value in that, and you can ensure that each one of your users will be getting what they're looking for out of the experience.
I love that. I think this brings up a good point where it's like with haptics, it's a huge learning curve, even as someone who's developing haptics. So I think the next question I'm going to ask Rolf is like, what are some of the things you've learned along the way that you think could help others who are interested in the space or kind of diving into the space so they can avoid like reinventing the wheel?
Well, good question. So basically, maybe taking one step back, what Sensrix does is, or what the vision of Sensrix is to provide very accurate interaction. And what we basically realized over the years is that most of the interactions are not actually at the point where you can provide reliable or immersive haptics, because it doesn't make sense to add some feedback if your position tracking of the hand is wrong.
Yeah.
Then it does make sense depending on the application, right? If it's just about you want to learn when you interact with some virtual object, then it's good. But if you have the you want to provide immersion or kind of a close to reality accurate feedback, then you need to really accurate tracking. So basically we took this the long way, we developed our own tracking, and on top of that we are now adding, since we are now reaching a point where we're really at the top of the game for positional tracking, peripheral positional tracking, we're now entering the space of also adding haptics to it. So there, it's really a matter of what you want to achieve, and I think for us, one of the good learning points is that you need to probably also ask very early on what the customers want. So, for example, you come up with an idea, or basically it might be good to place the actuators there and there, but then you realize actually the problem of your customers is completely different, and it wouldn't really solve it. So that's probably one of the take-home messages.
That's a great one. That's, start early and do testing, absolutely. How about Crystal, from your perspective? Like, what are the key things you've learned along the way where you're like, if only I knew this 5 years ago? 10 years ago, 6 years ago, 2 years ago, 6 months ago.
For me, I mean, when I first joined the company, I absolutely had zero idea about haptics. I didn't know like if haptics was necessary. I never really thought about it. But when I joined the company, I got to learn their vision, the company's vision and everything. And it was fascinating to me that, just little haptics in your phone, you never think about it until it's taken away from you. And when I learned that the Haptics wanted to make that more available with more content, that was really mind-blowing to me. So I guess I wish before I joined the company, I wish I knew more about haptics. But yeah, yeah.
Cool. That's probably a benefit, actually, that you kind of came into it fresh without an understanding, because there's kind of like different areas where if you're too academic, you come at it with like a thought process of it has to be this way. It's like it's science, and then if you come up with nothing, then yeah, it might be an interesting way to like bridge these worlds together and learn something new. Kim, I got to know from a BD perspective what some of the learning curves you've had, because doing business in haptics is hard.
I tell you, some of the learning curve is, do we move on software first or hardware first?
Yeah.
Because you've got both sides of that coin.
Yep.
And
I'm sweating,
it
yeah.
kind of, they leapfrog each other. You know, years ago, haptics as an industry started out with hardware, and you need the software to catch up in order to be able to go for the next iteration.
Yep.
And it's back and forth and back and forth. And I think where we are with Haptics right now, we're pretty square with where we are. We use microfluidics. We don't use vibrotactile. We don't use piezo. Everybody's got their own solution.
Yep.
And we found microfluidics works really well because we have the ability to manipulate and dial it up, dial it down, and make it nuanced in many different ways. But the microfluidic that we started using years ago was water. And as you might imagine, water and electronics are not the best of bedfellows.
Yep.
We're now using air, and air works great. But now, I mean, in our first iteration of the haptic feedback gloves, the water as a microfluidic also allowed us to do thermal reception. So you had not only nuanced to very pronounced tactile and force feedback, but you could feel hot and cold as well. And now everybody was like, oh, that's really cool, we love it, but it added exponentially more price. So we took out thermal, people are like, cool, they buy our gloves. Once we've moved to air, and now they're asking for thermal back again. So it's geez, you can't win for losing.
Yeah.
Hey, this is close enough to reality, but still not exactly real.
Yep.
So we're trying to get there, folks. It's just, we can never develop as quickly as we'd like. And again, it's always the hardware, software, back and forth. So it's where to dedicate your resources in order to come up with the next best iteration, and always keeping the door open for feedback and internalizing that feedback, which is what we've done between our DK2 model that we have on the show floor here and where we're going with our G1, which is coming out next year.
Awesome. Super excited for that. Alex.
Hello.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. Great. Having fun. Appreciate y'all.
I'm really having a good time right now. Yeah, this is good.
Cool. Learnings. What'd you learn?
Learnings.
Last 6 months? Because you've transitioned, so it's like, what are some maybe key learnings from starting your new position?
I'm in a business development role now at Contact CI, and something that I've been able to identify as kind of a learning is, as a strategic partnerships manager, like identifying potential partners that get it, I think is pretty crucial at this point right now. And what I mean by get it is like understand a little bit to Crystal's point, like the weight that haptics really do carry and like how important it actually is. You know, like there are a lot of people who you like might need convincing, and they're like, yeah, no. And for me, it's easier to, and I think more beneficial for us to identify the partners that understand why it's important. Something that I like to say from time to time is that the R in VR and AR is really not to be taken lightly. This is reality that we're talking about. And the experience that we're all sharing right now is a sensory perception experience. It's the culmination of 5 sensory perception organs amalgamating something and spitting it back to you.
Yep.
And a lot of the VR experiences out there right now, everybody kind of gives all the credit to the audio and visual, which is very compelling and very amazing.
Yep.
But the sense of touch in our human experience is arguably the most important sense we have. Like if you don't have a sense of touch, you're floating in purgatory and you don't know if you're laying down or standing up. You know what I mean? Like it's horrifying to think what it would feel like if we couldn't feel anything. So when we talk about AR and VR, I'm taking the R seriously. Like we are literally recreating reality. We are hijacking our sensory perception organs to create a new experience for your brain. And touch is absolutely crucial to that, especially in terms of confirming the experiences that you're having. Because if I'm doing a hand tracking experience and I'm like poking a button and I don't have a haptic glove on, I am poking nothing. I am poking thin air.
Yeah.
But the second I get that haptic interaction on my fingertip, I'm like, yes, I pressed that button.
Yeah.
It gives you this realism. Go
It's confirming.
Confirmation,
It
exactly.
makes the
It makes it
immersive
real.
environment all the more immersive, exponentially more.
Totally.
And the more real it is, the better it is. I mean, you can use a headset, you can use a really super nice headset and a pair of controllers, and you're just not going to be having the same experiences as you are if you are using a haptic device and able to interact naturally in the virtual environment. So the whole reason for virtual reality, whether it's consumer, enterprise, whatever it may be, is to simulate, is to have a manufactured means of interacting in a fashion that you cannot do in real life. So we want it to be as real as possible.
I love that so much. I think there's probably people in this room who are building stuff, and maybe they have a passion for haptics, or they like haptics, they want to incorporate into what they're doing, but their team's like, nah, we're focused on visuals, nah, we're focused on audio, we spend too much time. It's hard to find someone who can design haptics. What are some of the ways that you would suggest that they can help kind of like pitch haptics to their team? I think what you've said is great. I want to concise it up to one line even that they can leverage and try to get some buy-in to haptics, because we know the value and the importance, but it's hard for other people who don't understand.
I mean, for me, it's exactly what Kim said. It's that line of there's literally no confirmation that anything is happening unless you have the haptic interaction. You're poking thin air until you have a haptic experience. And that, to me, is the most compelling argument you can make, especially if you're thinking about it in terms of reality being a sensory perception experience and trying to recreate a new one. That's my answer.
So it's like you're A/B testing between those experiences. You've got rage quitting versus someone who's able to cohesively continue
Totally.
in an
And
onboarding.
often I go back and forth when we're doing our demos with Contact CI between the dual glove full dive immersion demo versus a single glove, one ungloved hand. Because if you have one ungloved hand, you can do back to back an interaction. You can flip a switch without a glove and then flip a switch with one. And when you flip it with it, you're like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
I get it. And it's compelling.
I mean, we as humans use our hands every day in our lives. It is just a native form of interaction with the world around us. Absent haptics, absent the ability to have a sense of touch, feeling is believing. So absent that sense of touch, in training surgeons in the virtual environment, and frankly, using surgical robotics, if you don't have haptic feedback, you're going to be causing damage that you otherwise would not. So it is necessary, not only for immersion, but for true functionality. And in the training environment, if you want to avoid negative training, you can't be using these controller things because you're just learning sequence.
Yep.
You're not learning how do I hold my body, how do I hold the tool, what is the way that I manipulate these things. You're just learning the logic, and you could be enforcing negative training. So we're trying to avoid all of that. I'm sure you guys have things to add.
I completely agree with what Alex and Kim elaborated, but yeah, it's so I think the hardest thing about haptics is that you don't realize it until you experience this. So it's hard to convince people to add haptics to their work. But I had this feedback from one of our customers recently. We had a software bug that made your old devices unusable, and they emailed us and saying I feel naked without it now. Fix it now, So that made us really proud. But at the same time, it's until they need to go out and try it. They need to come to these demos and try it, and then they will realize, he mentioned that when doing the one-handed glove demo, you realize that the experience is completely different. So yeah, I think it's about trying and.
Yeah, talking about haptics is not that exciting whatsoever. It's a lot of fumbling, a lot of it's like this, comparing it to things. But yeah, testing it is super important. Rolf, how about from your experience of pitching haptics? You're building a company. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, we're mostly in the professional training space. So where it's very important to be as close as possible to reality, because the customers that train using our systems are actually training for real life, for the R, right? So it's not about just getting more immersed. It's really basically limiting the friction between real reality and the virtual training part. And because if you're training in a virtual environment, you just said it, right? With controllers, you might learn a process, which is good. For some applications, it's perfectly fine if I know what I have to do sequentially. Sometimes it's really important that I actually feel as close as possible as in reality. I mean, a very simple example is driving a car by stick, right? You never watch where you have your hand, you want to feel it there. So there it's actually important that you would basically have the proper experience. If it's about just procedural training, then yeah, it's not that important. But depending on the use case, I think it's that thing you want to close the gap.
And working in the virtual environment, it gives you the freedom to fail. You're not going to be doing harm to anyone. You're not going to be breaking anything. So you can do it again and again and again until you get it right, until you can rip through this.
Exactly. We just recently did a collaboration with universities local to our office where actually they said they have data which suggests that actually training in VR is more efficient because you can fail. It's more efficient than you would train on a big machine where pushing that red button actually costs you 100K. Yeah. And basically, by being able to do it in VR, it inspires your creativity. You get a little bit interesting.
And you can have people work in experiences that they otherwise in real life, maybe it's too far, maybe it's dangerous, and you just take all those barriers away. So the limits are really your imagination and your budget.
Amazing.
And honestly, this is why at Context EI we build with ergonomics kind of at the forefront of our design, because if we are taking these skills that we're learning in VR and translating them into real life, we really think it's important from our perspective as a company to make sure that the product is being designed in an ergonomic way, so you don't have to relearn how to move or how to use your hands when you're now occupying haptic devices. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And similarly, in Sensorix, we're really focusing at high-level accuracy because it really does make a difference if you're expecting, especially for medical training, for example. It really matters whether your finger is half an inch away or not. So there, you need to be able to assure that the haptic feedback comes at the right point.
And you need to be able to leverage your proprioceptive knowledge. We've all lived in our skin our whole lives, so if someone were to throw a ball at you, you can just go and catch it. You don't have to follow it in with your, visual cues. And we were just showing, what do we call it? Team blocks. It's not Jenga, but it's very close to that game called Jenga. And you can play in the multi-user environment. And I was just watching this woman from Johns Hopkins, and her colleague threw a cube at her, and she just went and caught it. And that's great. That's all about tracking. That's all about being able to use your body physically in the environment, and it's accurate. It's showing up in the environment just like it would in real life.
Exactly. I mean, and there, the funny thing is, if you're completely immersed in VR, your brain fixes quite a lot. So some people have a better proprioception, others don't. But mostly after 5 minutes in VR, you forget that the tracking is a little bit off. But if you're really relying on that accuracy in the end, you're going to feel it if you're applying the task in real life. So that's why it's yeah.
Yeah, I want to take this in the direction that you guys are heading in, which for me is how haptics can be a superpower, especially in things like accessibility. So it's one of the use cases that stood out for me. It was proximity. So it's a helmet you could wear. It's got haptics where if there's someone coming close to you, it would alert you so that you know, because you don't want to be too close to people. There's a lot of different use cases. Have you seen any use cases that you want to highlight that may be interesting for folks to check out of how haptics can be used to more than just gaming or those types of things? So what people may expect from haptics, like smartphones or gaming controllers at Rumble.
After you.
Okay. So are you asking broadly, or are you saying therapeutically? Because I heard you say therapeutic.
Well, it could be broadly, just accessibility. Okay. Yeah.
Accessibility. So haptics is actually starting to do some work for the vision impaired, specifically the blind. In unlimited scrolling of Braille, and then moving into scene recognition and then navigation. So it's a crawl, walk, run very much. But we're working with, hopefully we'll get this NSF grant, but with a couple of universities here in the United States. And then therapeutically, I mean, there are folks that have come to us looking to work with haptics for prosthetic devices and giving people sensation where they've lost limbs. I don't know, what would you call it? People with PTSD or people with, fears and being able to overcome those. In the virtual environment, it's very safe. So you can take it at your own pace. And in physical therapy, to be able to work with, say, stroke patients, and you can squeeze a ball, and you can make it harder, you can make it bigger, you can change all that on the fly in the virtual environment. But you were also talking about using it as sort of a means of communication.
Well, yeah, like you said, Braille. Like that's literally, I should have just said Braille. Like that, you like hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
Like it's a set of vibrations that are coming through, and you can infinitely scroll, and that's amazing. That's exactly what I was talking about.
We all as humans have sensation, touch sensation all over our bodies, and we desensitize ourselves, with our clothes and just normal things, our interactions during our days. But imagine Air Force pilots. They are flying their plane. They're, of course, watching their instruments. They're watching outside the horizon, the people around them in their squadron. They're listening to people in their headset. They've got people talking to them. They've got a heads-up display. And they put an iPad on their lap. And they say, we still have more information we need to give them, but why don't you just haptically tap, 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 hey, look over to your left, they're like, just as volumetric audio gives you more ability to go from kind of 2D audio to really 3D audio. Where are all these sounds coming from? You can do the same thing with haptic sensation. You can reach into data fields and feel things. You have the ability to explore your world in a three-dimensional manner in the virtual environment through haptics that you cannot do just through visual and auditory cues.
Yep. Any other?
I like the idea, especially for the fighter pilots, because the cognitive load has to be very minimal. So, I mean, you can inject even more visual data, but then the cognitive load is increasing constantly, right? And you don't want to do that because he has to focus on a task. And if you can use your other systems to kind of provide feedback on a very spontaneous, maybe even kind of on a reaction basis, that's a big beauty of haptics.
So it's important for us to spread the word about haptics and the ability for haptics to convey information in so many different ways, because people are looking to solve for a plethora of issues all around the world, and it's not until you have these conversations go, what are you trying to solve for? And then we can say, oh, well, you need to get this or do that.
It's really augmenting actually what you can perceive in reality, right? Because you couldn't do that, as you said. I mean, you brought up the idea of a helmet which kind of gives you proximity, which is exactly something you can't do in reality. So some things, you just want to mimic reality, but it has a huge potential to also augment what you're actually capable of doing.
Yeah, Contact CI actually does work with the Air Force to provide them haptics for their hands-on trainings in the cockpit. And one of the things that we've heard from our end users is that oftentimes when they learn their order of operations, they flip these switches, and then they have 4 or 5 overhead switches that they don't look at. They are looking straight, but they reach up and they click those, and they're literally feeling for those switches. So haptics is a huge opportunity for Air Force pilots to train these no-look type of interactions. Exactly, but they need a confirmation when they reach up. If they're just thin air up here, they have no idea if they're hitting switches or not. And it's a really interesting thing that you brought up about amputees. There's this company, and I really wish I remember the name of them right now, but they are making a prosthetic robotic arm that can replace, of course, an arm that is no longer there. And in amputees, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll actually take the nerves that run through their arms into their fingertips and keep them, and bundle them up at the end of the nub at the elbow. And you can actually stimulate those by attaching a haptic sensation at the end of the robotic arm to that nerve ending. So when they use the robotic arm and press their index finger down on a table, they connect that to the nerve ending that used to be their index finger, and they say, oh, that's literally my index finger.
So
And
cool.
that is ridiculous. It's now providing the sense of touch to someone who has lost it. Technically they haven't lost it, because they could touch their elbow and be there's my index finger, there's my thumb, there's my middle finger. So it's crazy that we're able to use technology and robotics to kind of bridge that gap and literally give them their feeling of touch back.
Oh, that's hype. I want to also ask you guys, because I think it's important, because when you get excited about what you're talking about, it just gets me super hype. And it leads me to wonder what experience really spoke to you. Not your own company. It's got to be an external experience that you had that was with Haptics, that you were just like, this is enchanting, this is inspiring, this has like, it gets you kind of wild. I've always shared mine, which is like Waltz of the Wizard in Quest, where it's like you could feel the power of like a fireball forming in your hand. It's kind of ridiculous. I'm not going to use that any day in my life unless I'm going to turn into a huge pyro. But that was like one for me that I was like, this is just, there's something magical about this that pulls me into the experience. It felt real. I felt like superhuman.
I'm going to try to say this quickly. The very first purchase I ever made in my life with my own money, like, Mom, I will do chores. Can I please earn some money? Was Star Fox 64 on the Nintendo 64.
Okay.
And they packaged it with the Rumble Pack. And it
Nice.
was the Rumble Pack that I needed to get my hands on. It's so hilarious because now I work in the haptic space. Like, the first time I ever spent $1 was on a haptic device. So I guess technically that's the first answer. But it was a haptic experience that got me into VR, to believe it or not. I mean, I was already very much interested in the technology, but it's when I went to an arcade and got put into Rec Room, and I'd never been in Rec Room, I'd never been in a social VR experience ever, and someone asked me for a high five, and I gave it to them. And the controller vibrated in my hand and in theirs, and it like clicked in my mind that I just high-fived somebody across space and time, and I felt it. You know, like, that was amazing. And then finally, you know, when I got to be honest, when I first tried to be Haptics Fest, there was such little support and like, the support, in my opinion, wasn't like as well thought out as it necessarily could have been, that I wasn't super impressed. But it's when I tried a mod for Half-Life Alyx, and a lot of times when you think of a haptic experience in a game, you imagine like being shot, getting a grenade blows up at your feet, like all these like intense like battle moments and stuff like that. But it was when I grabbed a piece of resin in the game, and to put it in your storage, you drop it over your shoulder. I had zero expectations of this. I dropped the resin at my shoulder, and I felt the actuators fire down my back and like land at the bottom of the vest, and I was like, oh my God, I just dropped something in a bag on my back. And like, that made me a true believer.
Oh, I love that. Great game. Great game. Kim, how about you? What was that experience?
I think for me, it was, like I mentioned, it was the realization of like what is like missing haptics in life.
Yep.
But for me, like for someone who's really into mobile gaming as well, when I like shoot something and like when I play games, when I don't get any feedback, but like if I get someone that gives me feedback, and I can't see them in my screen, but I know that I got them, like I got it. So
Yep.
it's that satisfaction for me. And also like, it's also I think like, you mentioned the accessibility earlier. I think there is a lot of potential, great potential for haptics, what it can do in the future as the technology evolves. And that's also a fascinating factor for me, that it can do something so great for the entire world. Yeah.
So for me, it's similar than for you, basically. I'm looking at many applications or scenarios, and I think that's missing there. I want to have this very immersive kind of feedback. But maybe the first experience was with a force feedback joystick for a flight simulation, which is pretty simple.
Nice.
But it's already, I mean, it wasn't VR, right? But
Yep.
it's already, it creates a kind of immersion, and you have a direct kind of feedback there. And then maybe more profane example is the simulated button on, for example, on the notebooks from Apple or the iPhones, right?
Yep.
Because it really feels like if you're physically moving this, moving a physical button, but you don't. So having basically being able to reach that level of immersion in a VR environment, that's basically the vision that we're still having, and not
Or
yet
that
there.
iPod scroll. It's like,
Yeah, delightful.
Exactly.
you know, or the digital mouse scroll.
Yeah,
Like, they do such a good job with those.
yeah. The Surface mouse, yeah, I just played with that constantly.
Same, I
scrolling.
have
Yeah,
one.
just
I've
like, yeah.
literally been playing with mine all
Yeah,
week.
yep, exactly.
Yeah, I think my first haptic experience was, as Rolf was, it was one of those steering wheels from a home gaming thing, And when that kicked in, it was like, oh, wait, I'm feeling G-forces. It's like that. It captures your imagination. I think that's why I really like haptics. I love tech in general, just because you imagine the possibilities. When I worked at Microsoft and I would go to the Microsoft research, basically it's kind of like the science fair. They all showcase, hey, here's the cool stuff we're thinking about making, and look at it and go, this does what? Why do I need that? Oh, it does. Oh, now that I know it does that, I needed it like 3 weeks ago.
Yep.
So that's kind of where haptics is right now. The field of haptics has been around for a long time, but now we're getting to such a point in the virtual environment. In VR, in AR, people are really thinking about the necessity of haptics. And it's kind of the gateway drug is the headset. So you start out with an inexpensive headset, then you upgrade once you realize you're going blind. You upgrade to a better headset, better audio, and then you're like, oh wait, these controller things are just not cutting the mustard, so then you want to move into something that's giving you a better form of interaction with haptic feedback and natural interaction. And that's, who knows where we're going next. I mean, it's fascinating to think about what the possibilities are. Tech and working in this field, I dig it hard.
Let's ride that wave. What's the future look like to you in 10 years? And this is not on behalf of your company. This is on behalf of you and all the crazy stuff you've seen so far and where you want it to go. Let's start with Kim.
And it can't be about my company. Okay.
It can be. It
It
just
can
doesn't
be,
have
but
to
yeah,
be.
yeah.
So I don't know if you guys know this, but my company was started by a college dropout with an idea, and he started shopping it around to various engineering schools, and he found his co-founder in the professor of biomedical engineering at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. They started this company, and Jake and Bob, those are the good two guys' names, the idea for this company is, if you've ever watched Star Trek Next Generation, Captain Picard and his crew, if they want to go on holiday, where do they go? They go to the holiday. And that is the vision for my company. And that is frankly what I dream about. How do you have low impact mechanics or instruments, utilities, in order to give me a fully immersive and real opportunity in a fantasy or non-real world? And I think we're going to get there sooner than we might imagine. I think 10 years, yeah, I think we're going to be pretty darn close to that. So we start out with basics, the fundamental interaction, our gloves or your vest or, whatever it may be. All the pieces are going to start coming together really quickly, because then it's all about, okay, now I need to expand that to other parts of my body. Now I need to miniaturize everything. Then I give you some sort of propulsion, and you're off to the races.
Dear God, please let us have the holodeck. I love that vision, Kim. I love that so much. That makes me really excited. How about you?
I think regardless of how we get there, weightless and quiet are what I'm looking forward to. A lot of times the noise and the weight of your haptic devices can really be distracting from what you're supposed to be experiencing.
Yep.
You can do things to mask it right now by putting headphones on and having a really good well integrated audio experience as well, because if you're cutting out what's happening in the room, then you're not hearing the buzzes and the motors and all of that stuff happening. But wireless and weightless, I want to see it, and frankly, I don't really even care how we get there. I could see the actuators that we're using and the devices that we're currently using just getting smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where they're super quiet and tiny and weightless, and they work. I also see a lot of potential in the electro neural pathway stuff, where you put something on your wrist and it can determine what your intention is and then provide the haptic feedback based off of that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I think in the near term we'll probably just see in the 10-year term, we'll probably just see the actuators and the devices and all that kind of stuff that we're using get really, really small, really, really weightless, and really, really quiet.
Okay, think about under the lens of AI and how the computers are learning. So rather than thinking of the content that we create and how we can interact in the worlds that we've manufactured, what if we flip that? What if the computer then tells us what we need to do with our lives and our interactions? Ooh.
I want what Kim's on. That's brilliant. I love that. Thank you so much, Kim. Rolf, please. Future. What's it look like 10 years?
Well, most of it has been said. I'm going to jump into the holodeck without thinking. That's exactly the vision I'm also having. One thing to add to both of you basically is affordability and accessibility, right? Because you can build small devices and you can build, but I want to have something which is accessible to most people because it has so much potential to kind of change reality and change lives and then even change future, right? So, in order to do that, it has to be accessible to many people. So the price point is really a big thing.
Appreciate that. Bring it to something that will proliferate across and more people will be able to access. Appreciate that. Crystal, bring us home. What's the future look like to you? 10 years, haptics.
Well, I don't think I can say what it will look like in 10 years. But what I want, if you ask me, is because my background is my haptic experience within Haptics, I just think about from a consumer perspective, naturally. But for right now is we're doing consumer haptic devices, but it's for gamers. The market is still very niche, like VR gamers. But I hope one day it would make sense for everyone at home, just not just VR gamers, but for something that my father can understand too, without needing for it, without having specific needs for it, just in general life. Oh, yeah, we need haptics, for my parents' generation to be able to say to make it that available in everyday life. Yeah.
Love that so much. Well, we have come to a close. We've reached our time, so I want to please give a round of applause to these amazing panelists. There he is. We're good? Questions? We have time for questions or no?
Probably
One?
question.
Any questions? We have one question. If anyone has a question, oh God, don't give it to him. Don't give it to him. Anyone else? Oh, he's doing it anyways. That's fine.
It's okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Rolf, you have to explain the logo. Now you're cut off? All right.
You use all of them.
We first come up with the name, so Sensory X, and then if you split the name, it's the Oryx antelope.
Ah.
I got it.
I wasn't expecting the answer to be that cool.
No further questions from that man? Anyone else?
Absolutely love this presentation. I really want to thank you for doing it. I have a question with regards to accessibility. What do you see as the difference between haptics that are intended to supplement I think I'm too close to the speaker.
Haptics intended to supplement an experience versus a visual or audio experience versus ones that are meant to kind of replace, substitute the vision or audio to communicate information to something that doesn't have that sense.
Yeah, that exists.
Yeah, what's from the implementing the haptics perspective, from the design perspective?
So what we found in taking the existing demos that we have and having blind people use them is that we find that they are pushing through the virtual imagery. So they might feel a building and then they continue to push through, waiting for the mechanical stop, and there isn't a mechanical stop. So we'll require an exoskeleton in order to stop them from continuing to push through and feel that finite position. That is something that we're going to have to incorporate. Something Haptics is working on, but that's one thing. We, in the virtual environment, rely a lot on visual cues. So we need to, in serving the visually impaired population, we need to come up with other means of conveying, you've reached the end of this object, there isn't something else beyond it, because there's just infinite scroll, infinite space in the virtual environment, and the cues are not there. So it needs to be something designed specifically for that population.
Yeah, and this is kind of what I was getting at earlier when I was talking about using haptics as a method of conveying information that's not emulating, like touching something. Like, and I would probably be looking at it from a perspective of like, what language can I use using this haptic interface to convey the information that isn't reaching out and touching the wall? Like, there's got to be like a way to say, to use haptic devices that aren't emulating the experience that it's supposed to be, to say, yes, there's a wall here. You know what I mean? And maybe there's like a stronger vibration for wall than there is for, table, or like you can height differentiate that you can use, everything below your waist means X, everything above your waist means Y, like that kind of thing.
You can use audible cues as well to indicate the end of something. There's a lot of different ways to consider this. It's something that my company's just now starting to work on, so hold that thought.
Thank you, everyone.
Done. Thanks, everyone.